Hi, class. This is the last chapter of your textbook, chapter 14, and it's entitled Presenting Your Research. So this is a fairly short chapter, and it is pretty straightforward. So this video will not be that long. It will just hit some of the highlights of what you need to know when presenting your research. And so we are, of course, at that final step of the research model where we're sharing our results. And of course, keep in mind that is a big part of academia, really of science. That this is how we progress, this is how we advance by sharing our research, because that is what stimulates more ideas for research and leads people to make refinements to our research study, to our methods, to our question. It leads to the generation of new hypotheses, and then of course the model begins all over again. So your chapter begins with kind of just a basic overview of some important things to keep in mind when you're presenting your findings to an audience. And it notes that for a lot of undergraduates, your audience, your audience is your peers, as well as maybe your professor. So it's really speaking to doing a presentation in class. And so some of these points are related to kind of things to keep in mind before you actually, construct your presentation. Some of them are things to keep in mind when constructing the presentation, and some points are related to, when you're actually doing the presentation itself. So the first point, that you want to identify your main points while preparing your presentation. You really need to think about what are the things that you really that are most important about your project, what you really need to share with your audience. Not all of the points in your paper, in your proposal, are going to be as significant as other points. So, if you are doing a presentation, you really want people to kind of know, what is significant, what is important about your proposal, about your study. And that's not going to be every single point. So after you identify your main points, you then need to rank those topics. Because, once again, some points might be more important than others. For some points, they might serve as background information and are necessary to address before you can then address later points. So when you're thinking about constructing your presentation, there are going to be some topics that are more pertinent than others, and then there are going to be some topics that are going to require you addressing them earlier in the presentation as opposed to later. Now, when you are actually doing your presentation, your book makes the suggestion, tell a story to open your presentation before going into background. So really, it's about, you want to capture your audience's attention. Statistics, and findings are important, but they aren't the type of thing that immediately captures your audience's attention, that gets your audience interested and engaged in your topic, that creates in your audience a buy-in, right? That they are truly interested in your study. And so your textbook discusses this by comparing two different experiences of giving a similar talk, a talk on ADHD and psychiatric medications. And so they talk about, what happened when they just kind of opened with statistics versus opening with a story of a little girl who died while on Ritalin. And obviously the story was more impactful and the audience was more attentive when present it with that story first. But that being said, however you open your presentation, and you do want to open it in some way that is engaging, that does capture the audience's attention, but you don't want to be sensationalistic, and you want to make sure that you uphold the ethical standards concerning accuracy and anonymity. So, you don't want to overstate the significance of your study. You don't want to overstate your findings. You don't want to sensationalize them, to the point of it being inaccurate and overblown. And then at the same time, if you're going to open with a study, if you're going to open with a case, if you're going to open with an example or a quote, you just want to make sure that, you are not being necessarily salacious and perhaps exposing someone who expected, that they were going to be anonymous or that something was confidential. So you just want to make sure that you still keep those ethical considerations in mind. You want to grab your audience's attention, but not if it requires you, to engage in an ethical violation. Then your book moves on to kind of discussing, what comes next in the presentation. And they make the point that, a good presentation is going to address, the literature, it's going to address hypotheses, it's going to address methodology, and it's going to address, your findings. And it gives you some ideas about, what is the pertinent information from each section that you should be addressing. As well as the fact that, you're going to want to kind of develop some type of flow, right? So that you can smoothly transition from, providing the background and explaining, okay, and it was, based on this background, I generated these hypotheses. And then when it was time for me to test these hypotheses, this is the methodology I engaged in. This is how I gathered my sample, and this is who my sample ultimately wound up being. And then this is how I collected my data. And then ultimately, after collecting and analyzing my data, these were my findings. And it's usually in the findings where you really have to kind of rank, what are you going to address? Now, of course, in this class, because we're not really gathering and analyzing data, there are no findings, there is no actual sample. So this isn't something that you're going to have to be concerned of when doing your presentation for this class. Your books, kind of gives you a reminder that visual aids are okay, but what you're saying needs to be the focus. And so this is something to keep in mind when you're preparing your presentation for the class. My presentations are usually pretty text dense, because of course I am going to be holding you all to the standard of knowing the material and being tested on it. If this was just a presentation where you weren't going to be tested on it, and I was really just trying to get you interested in the material, then obviously I would be presenting this information in a different way. So, don't necessarily use my text heavy slides as an example of what your presentation slides should look like. What you're saying needs to be the focus. You use these visual aids and, make decisions about, what types of graphs or charts, or, if you're talking about background literature, should the, a photo of the book or the theorist be, on the slide, make those types of decisions, but know that really it's what's coming out of your mouth that is most important for a presentation. And then your book just talks about some practical tips. And some of these things are, they're less important when it's a virtual presentation as opposed to an in-person presentation. So, if it's virtual, we can't necessarily see your eye contact, or whether or not you have good posture, or, whether you have flailing body movements versus controlled gestures. Certainly don't know if you're dressed the part. You'll be amazed the number of videos that I do for my courses where I am in my pajamas. But, what we can tell, of course, is your tone of voice and speed. You don't want to rush. You don't want to mumble. You don't want to talk too low. And then just kind of being careful with humor. So, just as your book says, nothing can be more awkward than a joke that doesn't land. And I certainly think it is hard sometimes to insert humor in virtual presentations because you don't actually have any audience feedback to feed off of. So these are just practical tips to keep in mind. Whether you're doing a presentation virtually or whether you do a presentation in person. Thinking to more academic audiences. So what if you really did collect this data? What if you really did engage in your study and you had findings? What would be the next step if you wanted to share this beyond your classmates and your professor who is assigning the work? Well, your book discusses two options. They talk about presenting at a conference and they talk about publishing an article. So conferences are gatherings. They're hosted usually within your discipline by organizations or institutions or universities. They can be institutional, meaning, just kind of limited to a particular university. They could be regional, they could be national, they could be international. Usually, the national and the international conferences are larger and more competitive. So when we talk about, whether or not your application to present is approved or rejected, that rejection is more likely to come at the more competitive conferences versus the smaller institutional or sometimes even regional conferences. There's several options about, what your presentation can look like when at a conference. You could be giving a talk, you could be on a panel, or you could present a poster as your textbook notes. That's usually the most common option for undergraduates, particularly if it's at a larger conference. So certainly like your national conferences as well as some regional conferences, if undergraduates are participating, it's usually to present a poster and as your textbook notes. There are still really good reasons why doing that type of presentation is a good idea. It kind of allows you to participate in the discipline. It gives you, practice for how to address academics, how to take questions about your research, as well as just kind of the firsthand experience of being able to interact with other people doing research in a discipline that you're interested in. As the textbook notes, most conferences require an application, usually in the form of a call for abstracts. And so you submit your abstract that has pertinent information about, your study, its purpose, how it relates, to the literature, the findings, as well as its larger significance. A committee then reads those, and then they decide to approve or reject. And as I've already stated, if you are rejected, particularly at one of the more competitive conferences, just know that that's a pretty common experience, and you should not take it personal. You should not let it dissuade you, and certainly it shouldn't prevent you from applying to future conferences. The other kind of option for sharing your work to academic audiences comes from publishing an article. And of course, you've had to read research articles in this course. And I refer to academic sources and academic journals, and I talk about peer review. And so all of this comes up here in this chapter. So you can publish your study in a journal. A lot of journals are specific to fields or subfields within your discipline. Journals are operated by editors, and the editors usually make decisions regarding which articles to accept or reject. If the journal is peer-reviewed, there is this additional process of peer review where your research is anonymously evaluated by a set of reviewers, usually 2 to 3 who work in that area, who work in the field that your research is pertinent to. And so they evaluate it, and then they make a suggestion regarding whether it should be, rejected or whether it should be accepted. And they make that recommendation to the editor, who then usually ultimately has the decision to accept or reject your article. The thing about peer review is that because your article goes through this evaluation, this rigorous evaluation process prior to publication, it's a way of almost having quality control within academia. It's why some of you have heard me state or write on your assignments that peer-reviewed journals are kind of the gold star standard. In the wild west of the internet, people can almost put anything, or people do put anything on the internet. They establish their own blogs or online magazines, and it doesn't necessarily have that same quality control. And even in established newspapers and magazines where there is a little bit more credibility and journalistic integrity, it's still not necessarily, this same kind of rigorous process of peer review by other academics. And so this is why, a peer-reviewed academic journal, not that you can just trust, without question, the findings and the methods being used. But what you can trust is that this is an article that has been rigorously evaluated by people who are very knowledgeable in the field. And what reviewers often are looking for when they're making the decision as to whether or not they should accept or reject your article is relevance, writing style, study design, quality of literature review, and sample size. And so your book addresses each of these in a little bit lengthier detail. Relevance is the focus of the study of interest to a broader audience. So it can't just be a topic that is of limited interest, or is, of interest only to you. That doesn't mean that your personal interests can't be relevant to the scientific community. For those of you with a sociology background, embedded in that concept of the sociological imagination is that discussion of troubles versus issues, and the idea that issues are always someone's troubles. Not all troubles are issues, because some troubles are personal. They're limited to the personal scope of our individual lives. But every issue is someone's trouble, because if it wasn't, then it wouldn't really reach the designation of being an issue. Writing style is also important. In your book talks about this as a learned skill, and they give some helpful hints. And what is an acceptable writing style can vary discipline by discipline. So, the type of writing that is acceptable in the social sciences is maybe different than what you see in the physical sciences, which might be different than what you see in the humanities. So this is why it's important to do a lot of reading, a lot of academic reading within your discipline, to kind of get a sense of how do people in my discipline write? How do they write about their research? Study design. And, the quote from the book, having a strong methodology with a good rationale is your protective shield in the review process. So, for those of you who have been frustrated at my pushback in regards to your proposed methods, when I say, okay, well, your decision to do this type of sampling doesn't really align with your stated purpose, or, your decision, you say you're doing experimental research, but your question isn't really appropriate for that. And that's because this is literally like, I'm offering you your own little mini review process, that your methods need to make sense for your study. Because having a strong methodology with a good rationale, it is your protection that, you went about answering your question the right way. Quality of literature review, just think about what the goals of a literature review are. This is where you are trying to show clear familiarity with the work of other researchers, that you know what's been published, you know where the gaps are, both in the literature as well as in your own, it says your own review, but it should say as well as your own research. quote from the text, a great literature review sets the tone for a great study because the reader can see you have mastered the topic and are well acquainted with the literature. So, when you are really out there doing your own research in future classes, the literature review is important because this is how you persuade and reassure your reader that you are knowledgeable about this topic. This is kind of what establishes your credibility before you get to the part where you start presenting your own research and discussing your own findings. And then the final point is just sample size. Too small of a sample limits the impact of your study. You just aren't going to be able to make very strong claims about the significance and implication of your study if your sample is very small. And so a larger sample offers stronger validity and reliability. But it's worth noting that how large is large enough will vary based on the type of research method design used. So, what is considered large for a qualitative interview based study is going to be different than, online quantitative questionnaire study. So that is just something important to keep in mind. And the final kind of slide I want to end this presentation on doesn't come from your textbook, but this is always information that I present when I get to this step of the research model. Because in addition to kind of, what was the purpose of your question? Was it explanatory? Was it exploratory? Was it descriptive? Another way we can kind of think about the purpose, especially of sociological research, is to think about, what purpose is it supposed to have out there in the world? When we share our results, what are we sharing them for? What is our goal? Because the goal will differ based on whether you are engaging in what's called basic sociology, applied sociology, or public sociology. So basic sociology is really the type of sociology where the product is knowledge and you are really putting that knowledge out there largely for the benefit of fellow sociologists, people who are interested in sociology, academics. You publish your findings in books and sociology journals. And so it really is just kind of the focus here is on science, advancing knowledge. The kind of opposite of basic sociology is applied sociology. And this is where you use sociology to solve problems. And usually you're doing this on the benefit, for the benefit of specific firms or clients or agencies. And you're trying to change society. So this is the type of sociology that's oftentimes associated with societal reform, where you are going to be suggesting solutions, you're going to be implementing those solutions, and this is the type of sociology that's not just done for the benefit of other academics, but it's done for the benefit of practitioners. Public sociology is kind of a middle ground between research and reform. Oftentimes, your audience is policymakers, because you're trying to give them the information, the empirical evidence that they would need in order to make recommendations related to policy. And so these policy recommendations aren't the same thing as your research directly impacting solutions. So it's kind of more of a roundabout way, or, as it suggests, a midpoint, where you might be engaging in program evaluation, suggesting solutions, suggesting policies, but not necessarily implementing those solutions. And so the government, because they are usually policymakers, they are kind of a key audience if you are practicing public sociology. So, when you're thinking about, the potential implications of your study, another way you can kind of think about that is to ask yourself, is my question related to basic sociology, applied sociology, or is it kind of that midpoint of public sociology? Am I trying to influence policy? Am I trying to offer a solution? Or am I just trying to advance academic knowledge? And that is it for chapter 14.